The Swiss Army knife, arguably one of the most popular multi-tools in the world. Not surprising, given that this multi-knife design has been going strong for well over 100 years. Back then, the soldier knife was the main model that was issued to Swiss soldiers. But now, there is a huge variety of models that can suit your needs. I use the Evo Wood 17 as my everyday carry. This little dude has been on some epic adventures with me over the years. It's a small design, the blade only being about 55mm long. Can you get a fire going with a Swiss Army knife? Well, providing one of the tools on it has a sharp 90-degree edge on it, then you should be good to go. The only problem is, not many of the tools on the Swiss Army knife have this sharp angle that you need to be able to strike sparks off a ferro rod or fire steel. Now, in an emergency, you could use the actual sharp blade of your knife, but this is not a good idea. You will soon blunt the blade. The reamer also has a sharp angle on it, and it can throw out sparks, but again, you don't really want to be blunting this tool. The can opener also has a sharp edge, and this can throw out a surprising amount of sparks, certainly enough to get a fire going. But one of the best methods is the saw, or more importantly, the back of the saw. It tends to have a sharper angle on the edge, and it can throw out sparks nice and easily. You then don't run the risk of damaging the blade itself. The corkscrew, you could argue, is one of the most unused items on the Swiss Army knife. After all, what more can you do with it other than open up a bottle of wine? Not saying that's a bad thing. In fact, I use it for just that. Hazel is fast growing, and when it's cut, it can grow multiple shoots out of the same cut. It's an awesome natural resource and is regularly coppiced here in Britain. I'm cutting a section that is about 2 inches in diameter and as long as I can get it. Using the knife, I chamfer the thin end of the long stick. I'm not cutting it too deep, just enough to create a flat section. Then, screw in the corkscrew into this flat section, winding it up as tight as it will go. Because of the way this Swiss Army knife is designed, the saw is on the opposite side and you're able to unfold it. In order to make it more rigid, I'm just going to wrap some cordage around the knife to stop it from rotating away from the stick. Now you have a saw on a stick. But what's the point in this? Well, let's take this example. You might have cast a fishing lure up in a tree and it's got caught. Let's face it, we've all been there. With this technique, you can cut high up branches that would normally be out of reach. Just remember to only do short sawing strokes, as the saw is only very short. It takes some time and patience, but it does work. You probably don't want to go any thinner on the stick diameter, otherwise there will be too much flex and the saw blade won't bite properly. So, the corkscrew isn't so bad after all. If you take a stroll through a coniferous woodland, you might notice that some of the trees have a white, waxy substance that is flowing out of the bark. This is one of the best natural resources you can find. This pine tree is flowing with the stuff. It's called resin, not to be confused with sap, which is totally different to resin. All trees produce sap, but only certain conifer trees produce resin. Sap is a more watery substance that trees use to move mineral nutrients from its trunk and up and down to its leaves and roots to aid with photosynthesis. Resin, however, is different. Rather than harbouring nutrients that later get transported through the tree, resin consists of compounds secreted or deposited by the tree. Scientists are still debating to this day as to whether resin is a waste product of the tree, but it is thought that it's a form of protection against infection on damaged limbs or to prevent insect attack. Although sometimes there is a symbiotic relationship between tree resin and insects. Anyway, I digress. Here is a tree full of resin, and I'm going to collect it. Now, rather than destroy my knife blade, as the resin is very sticky and difficult to clean off, I'm going to use a stick to pull out the chunks of resin and collect it in a tin can. Once I have enough resin, I cut off a small piece of birch bark. I score the bark first with a knife blade, then begin to gently slice underneath the bark to peel it back without breaking. I then cut off a small piece of the branch of the birch tree. This is going to form the base that the resin will sit on top of. The bigger you make this, the more resin you will need. I'm keeping it small. You don't have to peel the bark off, but I'm going to anyway to make the outer bark sit more firmly against the edge. Now, I'm going to need something to keep it all together. For this, I'm going to use Scots pine tree roots, as they are easy to harvest and process, and they work well as cordage straight away. I use the back of the knife blade to take off the outer layer of the roots. It just helps to make them more pliable and easier to bend. Clear off any chunks of inner bark so that it will sit flush. And I'm also cutting off a thin strip of bark to act as a wick. Then I carefully wrap the birch bark around the base stick and tie it together with the tree roots. Now the candle holder is made. I empty out the contents of the resin and mould together the softer parts. Some of the resin is very hard, but some can be really soft. Stuff this into the candle and compress it down. Place the wick in and mould the resin around the wick to keep it straight. I then use the scissors on the Swiss Army knife to trim the wick down. Important safety note, folks. These candles are very flammable, and once you have lit them, be sure they are on a stable surface and not on the forest floor. You won't really be able to touch them once you've lit them, as the hot liquid resin can bubble out and it will burn you. Once they're lit, they're awesome. They burn a bright flame, but the resin tends to burn with a pungent black smoke, so keep an eye on where the wind is blowing. This particular candle burnt for nearly an hour before it burnt out. I've made bigger ones which have burnt for well over an hour. If you want, you can secure them to longer sticks in the ground, and they can act as a lantern and a bug repellent for your camp. Whilst on the topic of fire, here's a quick little tip that you can do. Use the saw to cut off thin peaches of a branch. I cut them about 3 inches in length. Then make a point on the ends of the stick with your knife. Place these in a tin can and put the can on the fire. The key here is to starve the sticks of oxygen. So you could either fill the tin can with sand, bury it, or in the case here, I put another tin can on top to act as a lid. Leave this to burn for about half an hour to 40 minutes. Take it off the fire and let it cool down. Once they have cooled down, you will notice that the outer bark can be peeled straight off, and underneath is a perfectly charged stick with a point. Now you have yourself a charcoal pencil. Use this to mark out a carving on a piece of wood. In this case, I'm going to use it to carve a spoon on this piece of firewood that I split, which leads me onto the next project. Use the knife to carve out a rough spoon shape. Remember, the bevel on this knife is only small, so this can be a time-consuming process. Once you have carved out a rough shape, use the point of your knife to dig a small hole in the centre of the spoon. Then rotate it round to carve away some of the material. Normally, you would do this with a specialist spoon carving knife like a crooked knife. But as you've just had a fire going and you don't have this specialist tool, you can grab yourself a piece of hot charcoal and use this to burn a hollow inside the spoon. I use another stick on top to keep the pressure on the charcoal burning downwards. You need to regularly add oxygen in order to keep it burning through the wood. The trick is to use long and slow breaths to keep that charcoal hot. It's more effective on a windy day. After a couple of minutes, you will notice the charcoal burning out the hollow shape of the spoon. All you then need to do is work on shaping the rest of the spoon, gently taking away a little bit of material each time. But it can also be handy for undoing very tight knots in cordage. Just work the spike through the cordage until you are able to form a small loop. This then gives you enough room to work out any remaining loose ends of cord through this loop. Chewing gum. Not something you really think of when packing your backpack with camping and survival gear, but it does have a few uses which might just help you out in the wilderness. If you use a tarp or a tent regularly in the woods, at some stage you might end up getting a hole in it. If you have some gum, chew on it to soften it up and use this to seal the hole. Once dried, it sets fairly hard and it will help you to seal up most small holes. Be sure to seal it up from both sides. Another way of sealing a hole in a tarp is to use paracord. Pull the cord through the hole and leave roughly 1.5 inches of the tag end. Then use a lighter to light the end of the cord. Use your knife to help prevent the heat from the flame from melting other holes in your tarp. As the cord burns down, quickly roll the flat of your knife over the flame to extinguish it and compress the melted material onto the hole. It should set within a few seconds and create a fast seal on your tarp or tent. Be very careful doing this, as some tent and tarp materials are flammable, so be sure to check first if you need to use this method. The chewing gum method is far safer and it can be removed when you get back home. If you find that your chewing gum has a shiny outer layer of paper, you're in luck. Unfold the paper and cut it into 4 strips, making sure that these strips are shaped like an hourglass. These 4 strips are 4 opportunities for you to start a fire. For the next step, you will need a battery. The head torch I use has a AA battery in it. Most torches and flashlights tend to use similar batteries to this. This material is conductive and the voltage coming out of the battery is channeled into the narrow part of the paper and it generates a lot of heat. Enough heat for it to ignite. To get a flame, I put one end of the shiny side of the paper on the negative end of the battery and then the other end of the paper onto the positive side of the battery. Now, you don't have much time when lighting a fire using this method, and it's pretty easy to get wrong, which I will demonstrate here. In this example, the narrow part of the paper was too thin and it burnt through too quickly. But on the second go, you can clearly see that the narrow part of the foil ignites as the 2 ends of the battery come into contact with it. The flame doesn't last too long, so best to be prepared with some tinder material to grow that flame into a fire. In this next demo, I use some dead bracken to pass on the flame from the chewing gum wrapper. It's not a survival skill that you will need to do often, but it's one of those that's always good to know how to do. Just be careful, batteries and flames do not mix well. When you need to be stealthy at night, the head torch can be a pretty big giveaway, with its bright light reflecting off all manner of things and giving away your location. If you add a simple piece of masking tape to the front of the light, it will help to cut down the flare given off by it and greatly reduce the reflectiveness of the beam. But it can still give you enough light to go about camp tasks in the dark. On first glance, this particular log seems far too big to split with just a small forest axe. However, you can apply some simple physics to help split it in half. Even the hardest of swings at this log is unlikely to split it first time. But if you bury the head of the axe just off the centre of the log and then lift the log onto your shoulder, rotate it so that your axe bit is now facing towards you and let the weight of it fall onto your axe, it should split fairly easily. The way this works is that the weight of the log is far heavier than the weight of the axe head. Therefore, you can only apply so much downward force when driving the axe into the log, and clearly it isn't enough to split the log. But by reversing the forces used and allowing the log to be driven down onto the axe with its own weight, it will apply a much greater force to the splitting process. There are times when you need to cut short, small diameter pieces of wood, and it can be really tricky to get any form of good grip for the saw blade to bite. But if you have a bow saw, you can lay a small flexible stick over the frame and place your feet on it to pin the saw down. Then you can pinch the top of the saw between your knees to help keep the saw blade straight. Now all you need to do to cut wood fast is to rub the log up and down against the blade and it will cut in no time. This method is totally the opposite of normal sawing, as you are moving the wood itself instead of the saw blade. Doing it this way allows you to put much more power into the cut, and you can find that it will cut wood faster than doing it the conventional way of moving the saw back and forth. It also means that you can cut much shorter sections of wood that you would not normally be able to do when pushing the saw back and forth. Making notches in wood for lashing two pieces of wood flush together, I would normally use a saw and then a knife. However, if all you have on you is a saw, you can still create a relatively smooth square notch. Using a small folding saw, I make a number of cuts in the wood, all at the same depth. Then, using the saw blade, I make a small twist to prise the cut open and the wood will chip off. I always make sure I'm not twisting the saw blade too hard and that I use the thickest part of the blade nearest the hinge, as this is where you can produce the most force. Once all of the small pieces of wood have been popped off, you can then clean up the notch by doing a number of pull cuts to clear any protruding pieces and square up the notch. A similar method you could do is to make a small cut near the end of the wood, then twist the blade gently and pop the small first piece off. Then continue with the next cut and do the same, and then the same with the next cut after that, until you get to the required length of your notch. By doing it this way, each piece of wood that you are removing is always on the outside, and therefore has much less resistance when popping it off. Once you've tidied up your notch, you can then place your sticks together and lash both notches together to create a right angle for things like door or window frames. What if you find yourself out in the woods and you don't have any flat chopping block to split wood on, and the saw you have is too small to cut any decent diameter chopping log? If you can find a sturdy dead tree on the ground, this is all you need to split down your firewood. Place the wood against the trunk of the tree, making sure that the top of the log is resting firm against the trunk. Keep your legs apart and bend your knees. Then simply swing down against the top part of the log, making sure you are driving the axe head towards the tree trunk. That way, if the axe misses, it buries into the tree trunk itself and not into the ground, or more importantly, not into your leg. The best method I find for splitting down wood to kindling size is to hold the log parallel against the axe handle. Make sure that the cutting edge of the axe is directly over the middle of the log and the other end of the log is against the axe handle. I then wrap my fingers around the edge of the log to keep it firmly against this handle. Then it's just a case of bringing the axe and log down at the same time against the chopping block or solid log, and it should split straight along the middle. Once it has been split once, it's much easier to split into thinner pieces, as there will generally be a flat section for the log to sit against the chopping block. Here is a dead standing pine tree, a great resource for shelter building. This pine tree has been dead a while, it has no canopy, and it would never have been able to grow much further due to the other larger trees blocking sunlight from reaching it. This one tree can have multiple uses. If you are in need of a temporary saw vise, you can cut the tree around waist height, then cut a V-notch in it. You can then use this V-notch as a vise to hold long pieces of wood steady when sawing. It's very sturdy because it's still held together by the root system of the tree, even though it's already dead. You can cut small pieces of wood on it too. When you are finished sawing, be sure to make a final horizontal cut as low down on the stump as possible. For some deciduous trees like hazel, willow and chestnut, there may be a chance of new tree growth from the stump in a few years' time. If you don't have a need to cut a tree down, but you are still in need of a vise to keep wood still when sawing, you can use a stick with a Y branch on it and place another stick leaning against this Y branch to form a frame to rest your log on. This form of saw vise works best with long logs, as the log you are cutting actually acts as another leg for the saw vise, almost like a tripod, and it makes it much sturdier. This type of saw vise is great, as you can adjust the height to whatever is comfortable for your needs. Whether you are a small or a tall person, the height of the vise can be adjusted to fit. You can even cut short lengths of log on it. But the best part is that when you are done, you can simply separate the logs from each other and they become portable. You can take them back to base camp or move on to another spot. When making a fire from a bow drill, you need to burn in the hole with the spindle to begin with, and then you need to create a notch for the wood dust to gather and for your ember to be seated. You can use a knife to make this notch, but this can be time consuming. If you have a small folding saw, you can make two cuts at angles towards the burnt in hole. and then remove the material to make your V-notch. It's much quicker and easier making the notches this way, as generally folding saws are crosscut saws, and therefore they are designed to cut across the grain of the wood, which makes it fast to remove the material to create the V-notch on a bow drill. In the UK, we experience an average of 159 days of rainfall each year. This means that for a large part of the year, we are having to light fires with wet, damp wood in less than ideal conditions. As a result of spending a lot of time outdoors in wet weather, I have adapted my bushcraft kit to help me get the best chance of getting a fire going in any conditions. Lately, I've kept a simple 1 metre square piece of waxed canvas in my kit. The first, and arguably the most important part of wet weather firelighting, is to try and find the driest wood. To do this, look for dead branches that are high up off the ground. Branches like these Scots pine ones are ideal, as there is plenty of resin that builds up in the joint where the branch meets the tree. Picking sticks up that are directly on the ground is not really ideal, as much of the moisture from the ground will seep into the wood and it will take longer to dry out. That's not to say you can't get a fire going with it, it just means that you will need to spend more time processing it down to make a viable piece of kindling. Whilst this particular branch here looks like it has ideal twigs for kindling, they will have sucked up the moisture from the forest floor and will remain wet for a few days. It's best to choose twigs that are high and dry and about the thickness of a pencil. To check whether a stick is dry enough, it should snap cleanly as it breaks. If it snaps, but pieces of bark still hold on, then this wood is still green, i.e. it has not been dead long enough for all of the moisture to have left the wood. This type of wood will still ignite in a fire, but only when a fire has been burning for hot and long enough for it to do so. It's not ideal for the beginning stage of firelighting. As I know the weather is changeable fast here in the UK, this is where the waxed canvas sheet comes in handy. I place my twigs and kindling on top of the mat, and this stops any moisture from the ground seeping up into the wood as I go to collect more material. The best natural firelighting resource that is available to me in this area is by far the bark of the silver birch tree. Here is a small piece I collected earlier that day, and to show you how flammable it is, I'm going to soak it in this small body of water and ignite it. After shaking off the excess water, you can see that the bark is still completely saturated. And if I hold a lighter to it, just watch how quickly it takes to flame once that initial surface layer of water has evaporated. The reason why it burns so well is because the outer bark contains betulin, which is what causes the bark to be white, but also protects the tree from bugs, pests and disease. The betulin is highly flammable, and it will often produce a black smoke as the oils burn off when you first light it. Whenever I see silver birch when I'm camping or out in the woods, I will always try and keep a small piece in my pack to stay dry for when I next need it for firelighting. But what if you don't have birch bark near you? Well, you can still get a fire going, you just need to use a different method. Remember when I spoke about not using damp sticks from the forest floor? Well, sometimes you might have no other option. In this case, find the driest part of the wood and cut out a small section that is free of any knots or side branches. Ideally, it needs to be as straight as possible. Here you can clearly see these two pieces of wood I have cut are wet on the outside, but on the inside they're relatively dry. If we can expose this dry wood, then we'll have a much better chance of success for our fire. I split the wood in half by using my knife and another stick as a batten. Once it's split open, the wood is nice and white, which means it's dry. So despite the fact that wood looks wet on the outside, the bark is actually what keeps the inner wood dry. All that is needed is to expose that dry inner wood. Now, using my knife, I make fine curls towards the bottom of the stick. These need to be as thin as possible, but not too thin that they fall off the stick. By doing this, I'm getting to the innermost part of the wood, which will be the driest. Once I've made a big enough feather stick, I tend to make a number of very small thin shavings with the tip of my knife. You don't have to do this step, but again, given that the wood is wet, it's offering the best chance possible to get that fire going. I don't tend to cut any corners when lighting fire with wet wood. I then lay a few sticks down to act as a raft and keep my fire off the ground. Fire needs heat to continue burning. If I tried to light the feather sticks directly on the ground, the cold from the saturated moss is going to sap the heat from the fire and likely stop it from burning well. I keep a small fire steel in my kit at all times. I lay my fire steel on the stick so that it is directly opposite those fine shavings that I just made. I then shower it with a few sparks, the fine curls ignite first, and then I tilt the feather stick vertically so that the fire climbs up through the curls. You don't have much time before the fire starts burning through the wood, and so I place a second feather stick on top to grow the flame. Ideally, a third feather stick will give you a more efficient burn. Then it's just a case of laying the feather stick down onto the layer of sticks and slowly adding small pieces of kindling on top and gently building the fire up as it burns. Being able to make a live trap for a bird or small mammal is a key survival skill to know. It can be applied to almost anywhere in the world, and all you need is a few sticks and some cordage. I start off by tying 2 sticks together at equal lengths from both the top and the bottom. If your cordage is slightly lower than the lengths of stick you have cut, then this should make a rectangle shape. Once the rectangle is made, twist the sticks and it makes an X shape. Lay this down on the ground. Next, cut or snap a load of sticks of roughly equal length and diameter. Put the first stick underneath the X and roll it to the end of the cord until it can go no further. Then do the same at the opposite end. With the next stick, place it underneath the X, but this time facing vertical, and roll it to the end of the cord as far as it will go. Then alternate again and roll the next 2 sticks horizontally across the X. Keep alternating between horizontal and vertical sticks. Each time that you place a stick in, it pulls the cord even tighter. As you work your way up to the top of the cage trap, start to use smaller length sticks. Essentially, you are creating a pyramid shape. The cord will start to get really tight once you get towards the top of the trap. I should mention that I prefer to use tarred bankline for the cordage on this trap. It has a coating on it which makes it slightly sticky and holds everything in place much better than paracord, which can often slip under tension. When you have done the final 2 sticks at the top, place a short stopper stick to wedge these top sticks in place and keep everything rigid. Now you have yourself a cage trap. Next up is to make the trigger. Cut a stick around 6 inches in length and roughly the diameter of your thumb. For this particular trigger stick, I am using an oversized stick just so it's clearer for the camera to see. Make a saw cut in one end of the stick, only cutting to half the depth of it. Then rotate it and make another saw cut on the opposite side, again only to half the depth of the stick. Now break the stick in half and you should have 2 equal pieces that fit perfectly together like a puzzle. Here is another stick which is going to be the one I will use for the trigger. Use your knife to slice away some of the material on the inside of the stick. I thin out the material at the top of the stick to increase the sensitivity of the trigger, essentially making it a hair trigger. Thinning out the material also creates a gap for the bait stick to sit in. Lift up the trap, place the 2 sticks back together, and place the trap back down on the trigger stick, which should be placed at an angle. Insert the bait stick, and then spread some nuts or berries on the inside of the trap, ready to attract birds or mammals inside. Once the bird or mammal moves around, it knocks the trigger stick and the trap falls down like a deadfall trap. And there's how you make a live trap. Be sure to check your local laws and bylaws in the areas that you are doing this, as in many countries across the world, this is illegal. If you find yourself lost in the woods or you need to call for help, just a 6-inch piece of hazel might just save your life. Bend over a small sapling and make an angled cut with your knife at the bend. The pressure of the sapling bending should make the cut much easier. Then cut the sapling clear near the base of the stump so that it can regenerate. Choose a straight section of wood that is relatively free of knots. Use your knife to make a number of angled cuts around the diameter of the sapling, and then flip it round and make a more angled cut towards the one you just made. Now you can easily split the sapling clean in half. Now make some slice cuts on one end of the stick. Eventually you should have an angled point. Then make a very small V-notch just a few centimeters back from the slice cut. It only needs to be a shallow notch, but make sure the cut is clean and not messy. Then come back about 6 to 8 centimeters and make a shallow slice around the whole diameter of the stick. Sometimes it's easier to rotate the stick as you do this. Now use the handle of your knife or another stick to lightly tap all over the outer bark. This is going to help break up the fibres between the inner bark and the cambium layer. Then hold the top end of the stick in one hand and the bottom end in the other hand and twist and pull the bark free. You might hear or feel a small pop as it breaks free from the inner layers below the bark. This works best in springtime when the sap is running. On dry and warm days, it's much more difficult. Gently slide off the outer bark, being careful not to split or rip it. Place this to one side. Next, make a slice cut about 3 centimeters back from the V-notch and cut towards the notch. You will need to make the V-notch slightly deeper at this point. Keep making thin slice cuts towards the V, but be careful not to put too much pressure so that you don't slip through the V-notch and split the end of the stick. Finesse is pretty key here. You can stop making the cuts when you've got down to the pith of the stick, so about half the depth of the wood. Next, gently slide the bark sleeve back onto the stick, making sure the hole in the bark lines up with the V-notch that you cut. And now you've made a whistle, which can make a really high-pitched sound and can be used to attract the attention of search and rescue or anyone nearby. You can even use this to make an SOS signal, which is 3 short blasts, followed by 3 long blasts, and finished with 3 short blasts of the whistle again. This can be recognised internationally. The great thing about this is that you can keep it as part of your kit and even tie a lanyard around it with some cordage and keep it on you as you go on trips. Another simple trap that you can make is a spring pole snare. All you need for this is one sapling, a knife and a bit of cordage. Find a small sapling that has plenty of spring in it. If you want, you can cut the sapling so that your trap is more portable and you can take it with you. Clear off all the side branches and leaves, and from the same sapling, cut off a section roughly 50 centimeters in length. Make some points on either end of this stick. Next, go to the very tips of the branches and cut off a short thin twig which can be used as a bait stick. Finally, cut another piece off around 10 centimeters. This will be the trigger. Now you have all of your components of the trap: a spring pole, a trigger stick, a holding loop, a bait stick and some cordage. Push the spring pole into the ground and tie some cordage to the tip of it. Next, pull the spring pole down to a point where it is under high tension. Then mark an area where the cordage meets the ground and push both ends of your hooped stick into the ground at this point. Next, tie your trigger stick to the cord, making sure that it's at the correct height, that when it's pulled down to the ground, the pole is bent over with it. Then tie a snare loop at the end of the cord. You can use a sliding knot for this, providing your cordage is smooth. However, it would be best to tie a small loop and feed the cord through this. That way, the cord runs freely through the loop and reduces the friction when the snare closes tight. In this example, I'm just tying a simple slip knot. Now, put the trigger stick underneath the loop and place your bait stick underneath to stop the trigger from flipping back under the loop. It's going to always want to do that as it's under tension. If you put a piece of bark or a stone underneath the bait stick, it helps to stop it digging into the ground and reduces friction. Lastly, place your snare loop over the trigger, making sure that the knot is right over the trigger stick. Now you can place some bait on the stick or around the bait stick, and once the mammal gets inquisitive enough, it bumps into the bait stick, which sets off the trigger and then sets the trap off. The snare snaps tight and traps the animal. To make your trap more efficient and increase your chance of catching game, build up some debris around the edges of the trap to guide the mammal into it. Something like a U-shape or a horseshoe to make sure that the animal has only one direction to go, and that's towards your trap. The Polish Lavu is one of my favourite pieces of kit. It's essentially 2 military ponchos that are buttoned together, and they can be quickly deployed into a 2-person tent just by adding a centre pole. They are made from canvas, which means they are really durable, but they're also on the heavy side. The ability to wear them as a poncho to protect you from the elements, and then quickly deploy them into a tent, makes them a versatile piece of kit to have. I've used mine in all sorts of conditions, including a multi-day winter snow camping trip. The armholes allow you to put a stovepipe through them, and if you have a collapsible stove, this adds to the compactness of this entire setup. I find canvas to be a great material for a tent. Despite it being heavy, it keeps you warm in the winter and cool in the summer. However, I would advise that you get some fire protective material to go around the arm sleeves if you are using a wood stove in there. Fire and canvas do not mix well. A simple Sialume glow stick can be really handy at night. It doesn't give off as much light as an LED head torch would, and if the batteries ran out on your head torch, then you have a backup light source if needed. They can be useful when trying to navigate without a light source. Despite being dead for years, the roots of a pine tree are one of the last things to decompose. When a pine tree has broken branches, it tends to send this resin to these affected areas to prevent bugs and bacteria from causing disease to the tree. When a tree is blown over in a storm, it sends the resin to the root system. This provides a valuable resource for firelighting. Cut off a root as close to the base of the stump as possible. You'll know you've struck gold when you see the dark red resinous area on the open end of the cut. These natural oils are what make it that colour, and they are very flammable. Take your knife and strip off the outer bark of the root. Whilst this can still burn, it's the resinous layer beneath it that you really need. Use the back of your knife to scrape off fine shavings of the resinous wood. If your knife doesn't have a sharp spine, you can use the blade, but over time you'll want to sharpen your knife edge, as doing this often will start to dull your blade. Now use your fire steel to scrape off some sparks into the fine resin shavings, and they will readily ignite. They burn for a considerable amount of time, allowing you a bit more freedom to place fine twigs on top and begin to grow your fire. The great thing about using this resin to light a fire is that it burns well even in wet weather. You'll notice black smoke emitting from the flame, and this is the flammable oils burning off from the resin. You can keep the stick in your firelighting kit ready to be used again in the future. Given that you only need a small amount of shavings to get a flame, it should last you a considerable amount of time. Bankline is a useful piece of kit. I use tarred bankline for a lot of bushcraft projects, as it's rot resistant and the coating on it helps to prevent knots from slipping. It's also much thinner than paracord, and so when you store it in your kit, it takes up much less space. But an added bonus is that due to the tarred coating, it burns really well when you put a lighter to it. Admittedly, I wouldn't do this all the time, as it gives off a pretty pungent, unfriendly smoke. It also burns well in wet conditions, so it can be ideal for getting a fire going. In addition to that, it often drops little melted balls of tar, which you could use as a makeshift glue if you are securing arrowheads to a shaft, or to patch up a hole in a tarp or tent. Just light the cordage, hold it horizontally for a few seconds, and then a globule of melted twine will drop off. Be wary of getting any of this on your skin though. Leather is a craft item that is readily available nowadays. You can go online and order a piece of veg tan leather and have it arrive on your doorstep the next day. For centuries, our ancestors have been tanning leather and using it for clothing as well as armour. Leather can be made from a number of animals, but you can also make leather from fish skin. First, you need to skin your fish and descale it using a knife. You can still make leather with the scales on, but you can create a much more supple leather with the scales off. Now you can brain tan the fish skin, but the solution you get from it is so small and minimal that it takes a lot of effort. Instead, I make an oil-based tan solution using 2 egg yolks, a teaspoon of vegetable oil and a tablespoon of water. I soak the skin in the solution for about 30 minutes, working the oils into the fibres of the skin with my hands. Then I make a small jig from a small round stick and 2 support posts. I then soak the skins in water for 5 to 10 minutes before working them over the jig back and forth to help break up the fibres and make them more supple again. Then I make an oak bark tan solution. To make it, I just chip off the outer bark of an oak log and then put this into a Dutch oven or metal container. Place this on a fire and let it boil away for an hour, after which the tannins from the bark will have been released into the water. Sieve out the bark solution into a container. Once it's cooled, put the skins into the solution and leave it for a week. Stir the solution each day to prevent build-up of mould on the surface. After a week, the bark tan solution will have penetrated the skins. I then put the skin back into the oil tan solution, but add a small amount of natural soap just to clean off any mould build-up. I also add half a litre of water. Then I work this over the jig back and forth until it dries. I add some leather balm and work this again through my fingers. After a few hours, the oils will have penetrated the fish skin to make it supple enough to craft into a usable item. If, however, you don't have a 90-degree spine on your knife, you can either file one on there, or if you have a folding saw, such as a Silky or a Barco, these have very fine, thin spines, which can be really effective at getting sparks from a ferro rod. The great thing is that you barely have to put pressure on them compared to using your knife. The great thing about small hatchets over large axes is that they are portable. You can often carry some of the smaller ones on your belt. The issue I've found with having them tucked into your belt is that they can really restrict movement. You can eliminate this by using a simple piece of paracord. Take a piece of the cord, bring the ends together and tie them in a knot. This creates a loop. Now pass this loop through your belt and then pass the knot through the loop like you would with a prusik knot for tying onto the ridgeline of a tarp. Pull the knot tight and you have yourself a small loop dangling from your belt. Now you can pass the handle of your hatchet through this loop and it will sit close to your hip, but not too tight that it restricts your movement. Whenever you go to kneel down, the axe moves freely. It's also dead easy to deploy whenever you need to use it. Once you're done, just loosen the loop and pull it free from your belt. You can keep this piece of cordage in your kit, ready to deploy whenever you need to use it. It doesn't have to be used for just hatchets too. I've also used it for carrying a water bottle on me. The clematis vine can be a valuable resource for bushcraft and survival. The thicker parts of the woody vine can be crafted into a half-board for bow drill. The thinner parts of the vine can be woven together to form a basket. Gently pull the vine down, gathering a mixture of thicker and thinner ones. Make a spider-like structure with 3 pieces of the large vine. Then use the thinner vine to weave in and out of each spoke, moving diagonally. With the base finished and about the size of your hand, then you can start to weave the thicker vines in and out of the spokes. To finish off, cut off the ends of each vine or fold them back into the basket. Leave 2 opposite ends remaining and lash these together to create a carrying handle. Now you have yourself a basket which you can use to carry your wild edible food. The roots of many conifer trees grow relatively shallow, especially those of the pine species. Use a stick to dig through the soil to locate the thinner roots which are near the surface. Follow the root along from the tree and gently prise it up. Take off the rigid outer layer of the root using 2 sticks or the back of your knife. This will expose the flexible inner layer. You can make the root more pliable by splitting it in half with a knife and peeling back the sides evenly. You can take this one step further by bashing the roots with a stick to break up the fibres. Soak them in water for an hour to make knot tying easier. You can use the root as it is for simple bindings, or you can weave 2 or 3 roots together to make a stronger ply cordage. Use these roots to lash sticks together to make bushcraft shelters and primitive traps. Not just the roots of a tree that can be used for survival. The inner bark of some species, such as the western red cedar tree, can be peeled away and used in a similar fashion to the tree roots. You can make it more pliable by soaking it in water and tearing it into thinner pieces and weaving them together. Here you can see the inner bark to lash together a hazel frame when building a Native American wigwam. The inner bark of cedar can also be used to make fire. As the tree matures, the bark becomes rigid and fibrous, to the point where you can simply peel it off in thin strips. You'll need to break up the fibres first before you can get it to ignite. Do this by rubbing it between your hands to fluff up the inner fibres and separate them from the tough outer bark. Eventually, you will create a small tinder bundle. Now you can shower it with sparks from a fire still and it should take to flame fairly easily. If you're prepared, you can make a number of these small tinder bundles and keep them in a fire lighting kit in your backpack. So you're ready to light fires whenever you next need to make up camp and shelter for the night. As if that wasn't enough, the bark can also be used to make tiles on the roof of a shelter. When a cedar log still has moisture in it, you can peel away the bark in one piece, using either your knife or a stick with a point on the end. Sometimes you might even be able to use your hands to gently prise the bark away from the log. I've used cedar bark on a number of different shelters, like this Native American wigwam, or this larger Viking-style house. It's a brilliant resource for bushcraft and survival. But one thing to note when using it as a roofing material is to be aware that as the bark dries out, it will shrink, and it can leave gaps in the roof of your shelter. So where possible, try and overlap the layers or double layer it. Many coniferous trees produce resin, a sticky glue-like substance that trees produce when wounded from broken branches or being attacked by various pests. Scrape the white resin off with your knife or a stick. I would recommend using a stick as it's a pain to get off your knife. Put it in a metal container and place this on the fire for a few minutes. Once melted, it will look like black tar. This is called pitch. It's highly flammable due to the high levels of resin, but while it is warm and malleable, wrap it around a stick and let this dry. Once dry, it sets hard as rock. This is nature's primitive glue, and now you can reheat it up and use it to seal joints on any timber frame shelters you build, or better still, use it to secure arrowheads to shafts. This tiny plant is known as the pignut. Its Latin name is Conopodium majus. It kind of looks like the leaves of a carrot. But it's not what is above the ground that we are interested in here. Use a small stick to dig away at the base of the stem, being careful not to break it. Eventually, you will find a small tuber, which looks like a nut. Brush off the outer skin and dirt, and crunch away on the nut. It tastes a bit like hazelnut, and is very high in calories for its size. Be aware, this plant is part of the Apiaceae family, which contains a number of plants which can kill you pretty quickly if you ingest them. Be sure that you have confidently identified it before consuming. Some conifer trees produce small blisters. Balsam fir and Douglas fir are classic cases of this. You can clearly see the blisters on this small Douglas fir. These blisters are full of resin. Use your knife or a stick to pierce the bark and collect the resin. This resin has antiseptic properties. If you have a small cut or graze, you can apply some of the resin to help prevent the cut from getting infected. As well as this, the resin is highly flammable and can burn for a long time. Shower it with sparks from a ferro rod and it should ignite easily. One of the most underrated items in my kit is a tube of porta wipes. This little tube contains 10 compressed tissues. And by compressed, I mean seriously compressed. Each tissue is about the diameter of a £1 coin. All you need to do is to add water to them and watch them expand into a pretty durable wipe, which you can use for cleaning your hands, washing your face, or even to help wipe excess blood off superficial wounds, providing you use sterile water of course. They don't break up like normal tissues would. They are more of a wet wipe. It does say that they are biodegradable, but I still take them home to dispose of. They're an awesome piece of kit, even if you're just into camping and hiking and not the hardcore bushcraft and survival stuff. I find them really useful. I'm not sponsored by them. In fact, I was sent them by a subscriber years ago. I just genuinely use them regularly. Another small item that I keep in my pack at all times is a lightweight tarp. This one is a 3x3 meter one by DD. I'll link to it below, but any tarp can be used to make shelter. I just opt for one that is very compact and small. If I know conditions are going to be wet, then often I will stuff my tarp in one of the side pockets of my backpack. This is where having a lightweight thin tarp is useful. At one end of the tarp I will have some cordage tied to it, and this will be the last part that I put into the pocket of the pack. This side pouch is just over a litre, and the 3x3 meter tarp fits snug and the zip can be done up. And now we wait for the rain. Many times I've been out in the woods and the weather has caught me off guard. The forecast has said no rain, but I've suddenly been hit by a downpour and had little time to get under cover. This is why I have honed some of my kit so that I'm fully prepared for this. If you haven't checked the weather before you've gone out on a trip, you can often tell when bad weather is about to hit. Signs I look out for is a sudden drop in temperature, the air feels cool and fresh, and the wind will start to pick up. And whilst this might feel nice when you have been cutting up firewood, get ready, as you won't have long before the rain arrives. This is a weather front, and depending on the strength of the wind, you need to be ready to deploy a shelter quickly. And this is where my favourite tarp shelter comes in. Find a tree. Any tree will do, but preferably one that is sturdy. I pull the cordage out of the pocket and tie this corner of the tarp to the tree. I try and tie it as high as I can, as 3 meters will offer quite a bit of shelter, and the higher I tie this corner of the tarp, the steeper the angle will be to shed water. However, if you want more space underneath your shelter, then tie it around head height. Now I just use the weight of the backpack to pull out the remainder of the tarp. By keeping it inside the pocket like this, not only does it allow for quick deployment, but it also means that the tarp doesn't blow and flap around everywhere in strong winds. Now it's just a case of pegging out each tie-up point of the tarp, trying to keep the material as tight as possible. I can set this tarp shelter up in less than 3 minutes and have all my gear in the dry. To stop the kindling I have collected earlier from getting wet again, I just roll the wax canvas sheet across it and it keeps the rain off. Alternatively, I could put the kindling under my tarp, but then the ground under the tarp is already damp. With the firewood prepped and sorted and the gear dry, I then make some final adjustments to the tarp. You can see that even in this heavy rain, the water just runs off this waxed canvas sheet. I decided to leave it outside to see how dry it would keep the wood. As I said earlier, the best natural material for fire lighting in this area is silver birch bark, and so I use my knife to scrape the outer bark into a fine dust pile. Just underneath the outer white layer is where the flammable oils of the bark are. Now I'm under the tarp, I can take my time getting the final preparations of the fire ready. The ground in this particular area is saturated all year round. It's basically a bog, which is another reason I chose it for this episode. Despite the fact I don't really need to clear an area for a fire because the ground is so wet, I still think it's good practice to do this, as I want to be able to leave no trace of fire once I pack up camp. As I demonstrated earlier, I create a raft using small sticks. If you want to increase your chance of fire, you can split slightly larger sticks in half to create a flat, dry area to build your fire on. Now I use that waxed canvas sheet to protect the birch bark from the rain. It's imperative that the birch bark powder is kept as dry as possible. It will still ignite when wet, but it will take longer to burn the more saturated it is. Once the dust pile ignites, you have a few seconds to keep the fire going. To do this, I peel off a number of thin strips of the birch bark and get this lit from that first flame. It can take a while, but relying on the dust pile alone to get your twigs ignited isn't enough. You need to get that flame going for an extended period of time, and to do that, I carry it over to small strips of bark. Once these small strips have a more established flame, then I lay the twigs down on top of it. You'll notice that I place the horizontal stick underneath the twigs before I lay them down. This is so that I can raise and lower the twigs to allow more oxygen to help the flame catch them alight. Throughout the early stages of the fire, I keep my body hunched over it to try and keep the rain off. With the rain being so heavy, it could easily put the flame out. And here's a top tip. I won't put the next layer of sticks on until the flame rises above the previous layer of sticks, and I apply this to all of my fire lighting in both dry and wet conditions. Too many times over the years I've put a fire out by putting on too much fuel too early and smothering it. When a fire is only just going, I find it best to let the flame creep above the first layer of sticks before adding the next layer. This allows the heat to build up at the base of the fire, as well as allowing more oxygen in. Once the flame is well established, then I don't have to hunch over it anymore, as the heat at the base of the fire is enough that providing I keep adding fuel to it, it won't go out. If your fire is still struggling at this point, then it doesn't hurt to add more oxygen by blowing into the fire. You only really need to do this at the beginning stages, or at least until you have enough of a roaring flame. And now you can relax and enjoy some time in the woods. This particular woodland is damp all year round. This is evident from the dense patches of moss that are spread throughout. Trying to find dry tinder in environments like this can often be quite tricky. However, despite the ground being soaking wet, there is still a natural material that grows amongst it that can be made into a usable tinder once it has been prepared well enough. You'll notice the white blades of grass growing amongst the moss. If you focus on collecting the thin, broad blades of grass, these are often the driest. gather a good handful of grass and rub it between your hands. After a few minutes, the heat that builds up between your hands will start to dry out the grass. If you continue to rip and break the fibres in between buffing it between your hands, it will help to make the tinder more fluffy, which is what you need for it to catch a spark from a fire steel or an ember from a bow drill. Continue to collect the grass, as more often than not, you need double the amount you think you need. Here is a quick tinder bundle made in around 5 minutes from picking up the wet grass. You'll see it is compact and it looks like a small bird's nest. And now, just a few sparks from a ferro rod will help the tinder bundle to ignite. As the grass is quite damp, you'll need to add oxygen to help encourage it into a stronger flame. Maintaining a campfire can sometimes be an arduous task, especially during the earlier stages when you need to constantly keep feeding sticks in the fire until it gets hot enough to create coals. One of the ways to create a low maintenance fire is by building it upside down. By that I mean start by sawing off a few lengths of large dry logs. The thicker and longer the log that you cut, the bigger your fire will be. For this example, I'm cutting a length of around 40 centimeters and roughly 10 centimeters in diameter. In layman's terms, that's basically a log the length of my forearm. The species of wood that I am using here is ash, which burns well on a campfire. The important thing to remember is to choose the driest wood possible. Next, I cut a load of smaller sized logs to the same length. I then use my axe to split some of these smaller logs in half to expose the dry inner wood. And now for the fun part. I start by building the fire upside down. First I lay down the thickest logs, then I lay the thinner ones perpendicular to the ones below. On top of those I lay the split logs with the exposed wood facing upwards. I continue to build the fire lay until all of the split logs are used. It's kind of like making a Jenga tower. At the top of the fire I lay small dry twigs. Now all you need to do is light a fire on top and watch as the magic happens. This time I decided to light the fire with a traditional flint and steel method. I strike the steel down onto the sharp piece of flint, which causes sparks to catch onto the char cloth. I then place the char cloth into the tinder bundle, which is the bark of the honeysuckle vine. I blow some air into the tinder bundle to force oxygen in, and then the fire ignites. I add a few thin strips of silver birch bark, which will help to extend the flame. Then I just add a few twigs to build the initial flame up, and I can sit back and let the fire burn. There is no need to go and hunt for more firewood to keep adding to the fire. Each layer burns and then the coals drop onto the layer below, which allows the fire to continue burning. Here is what the fire looks like after 30 minutes. It's burning with a hot, clean flame. And here is what it's like after 1 hour. And finally, here is the fire after an hour and a half. I have not had to add any sticks to the fire in this time. These coals would be great for cooking on. So, whilst the initial part of collecting the firewood takes a bit of time, once the fire gets going, it requires very little maintenance. The fire would have probably burned for longer if it wasn't such a windy day. Whilst this fire is burning, let's take a look at a method you can use to boil some water over it. I cut 3 sticks to equal length. Then I lay the sticks next to each other and secure them with some bank line. The knot I use to secure them is an arbor knot. Once the arbor knot is cinched tight, I take a number of wraps of the cordage around the sticks. Normally 3 wraps does it. Then I do some vertical wraps that weave in between the sticks and over the horizontal cordage. These are known as fraps, and these help tighten the whole lashing. Again, I do these about 3 times in between each gap. With the knot secure, I can lift up the sticks and form a tripod. The lashing will tighten as I splay the legs out. You'll notice I have deliberately left a length of bank line. At the end of this line, I'm going to tie a marlin spike hitch. It's a dead easy knot. Apologies for the out of focus shot here, but you can still see how it's tied. First, I make a loop in the end of the line. Then I bring that loop up to the centre line above it to form another loop. I then pass a stick through the loop and behind the centre line. Then I cinch the knot tight against the stick. Now I can pass this stick through the bail arm of a billy can, and it allows me to hang the billy can directly above the fire. The cord will spin for a few minutes as it's been twisted up where it has been stored in my backpack. To get the billy can closer to the heat of the fire, I just widen the tripod legs. A benefit of this type of fire lighting is that it's reusable. Much like a fire steel can be reused over and over again. The steel striker will give you thousands of sparks before it starts to fail you. The flint, on the other hand, will start to lose its sharpness after just a few uses. You can make your own flint shard fairly easily. Here is a piece of flint I found in the woods. It already has a fairly sharp edge where it's broken off from another larger piece, and it can still throw off some sparks. However, if you use a larger stone and strike the flint in a downward motion, you can often crack off smaller shards of flint which are far sharper. The inner pieces of the flint have sharp edges. This will throw out good amounts of sparks before they dull. And now that one large piece of flint has been broken into multiple usable pieces which you can stow away in your fire lighting kit for later use. A more modern backup emergency fire lighting technique is the inner tube of a bicycle tyre. This small piece keeps the lid secure on my flint and steel kit. If I am in real need of lighting a fire quickly, especially in adverse conditions like strong winds and rain, I can cut off a thin strip of the inner tube, and then tie this into a knot and hold a lighter to it for a few seconds. Being rubber, it burns really well, and allows enough time to burn through damp kindling. As it burns for a while, you only really need a small amount to build up a fire. The smoke it gives off is toxic, so I would only use this method of fire lighting in an emergency, but it is a great backup option to have. Some knives don't have a sharp 90-degree spine. For example, this Halterfor's knife here wasn't manufactured with a 90-degree spine, which means when I go to use it on a fire steel, it really struggles to get sparks from it, and I have to apply a lot of pressure and effort to generate these sparks. If your knife doesn't have a 90-degree spine, it's okay, as with any bushcraft knife, there is an area on the tip of the blade where the two sides of the grind meet. This will usually have a sharp 90-degree angle, which you can then use to get sparks from the ferro rod. You don't have much room to manoeuvre like you would when you can use the whole length of the spine of the knife, but if you get the angle right, you can generate a large amount of sparks in a concentrated area. If you worry about using your knife on a fire steel, and your fire steel doesn't come with a striker attached, then you do have another option. The spine of many saw blades will have a 90-degree angle on it. For example, this folding handsaw here has a sharp edge on the back of the blade. This can be used exactly like a striker, and in my opinion, you can produce more sparks using the back of the saw blade than you can with the little flat strikers. Most fire steels come with a hole in the handle or the rod for you to tie some cord to, so why not tie something bright to it? That way, if you do end up dropping it on the forest floor, the cordage stands out against the leaves and debris, making it much easier to catch your eye. Alternatively, you could add some fire lighting paracord to the handle. This paracord has some waterproof flax fire cord inside, which is flammable. That way, if you find yourself needing to light a fire, and you don't have much tinder available, you can undo the paracord from your fire steel and pull out a length of the flax fire cord. Then scrunch this up in a ball and throw some sparks on it with the fire steel. It lights pretty quickly and burns with enough time for you to add some fine twigs and kindling and build up your fire. So you can make a small bushcraft stove from a log with just two tools. First, cut a log with a minimum diameter of about 5 inches. It can be as tall as you want, but the shorter it is, the more sturdy it will be. For this example, I am using a Scots pine tree, as it is a softwood and full of resin, which means it will be easier to ignite and burn with a strong flame. You can use hardwoods, but they tend to smoulder more and produce less flame. The next step is to use a hand auger or a barrel-eyed Scotch auger. These are essentially a large 1-inch wood drill bit with a barrel eye. This is where the wood handle slots into. If the wood ever snaps, you can just carve a new stick to replace it. I keep a cork on the end of the bit to prevent it from cutting through my backpack. Now I start to drill a hole directly in the top of the log. This part can take a while, which is why softwood is better, as it would be a lot harder using hardwood. Once I've drilled to the depth of the auger, I offer it up against the side of the log to see where I need to make the second hole. Now I drill into the log until this hole meets the first one. I use a stick to check that both holes are now connected, and that means that air can flow through them. This type of stove is also known as a rocket stove, and you will see why in a minute. A useful piece of kit that I recently acquired is the Sidekick fire starting necklace by Forest Fundamentals. This is essentially a necklace with a mini fire steel and striker attached to it. When I am ready to light a fire, I just pull the necklace at the back and the magnetic breakaway clasp releases. Then I just slide the fire steel up the survival cord and it's ready to go. It throws out a good amount of sparks for such a small fire steel, and it's easily enough to light this small pile of birch shavings from the bark of the silver birch tree. So let's use it to light the rocket stove. I peel off some thin strips of birch bark, then I scrape a pile of birch bark shavings. I throw a few sparks onto the dust pile and it ignites. I then pass this flame onto some of the thin strips of bark and place these into the hole on the top of the pine log. Then I feed some small twigs into the side hole and blow air into it to give it more oxygen. After a few minutes, the twigs on the inside of the log will burn and turn to hot coals. Then it's just a case of adding more twigs to build up the heat inside. Once the stove gets hot enough, I add a few stones around the edge. Then I place my cookpot, frying pan or canteen cup on top of these stones. The stones allow more air to flow through the holes. After 10 minutes or so, I don't need to add any more oxygen myself. I just turn the log so that the hole is facing the direction of the wind, and it will burn happily now for well over an hour. You can see that when I lift the canteen cup off the stones, it's now burning with a really clean flame. This indicates that the log is hot enough to burn on its own. Within 10 minutes of it being on the log, the water is now boiling, and I can continue to use it to cook food and leave minimal impact or fire scar on the ground. I can also easily put the fire out and take the log with me to a different camp if I needed to. However, if you wanted, you don't even have to use the rocket stove as a stove at all. You can easily turn it into a really effective bug repellent. This time, when you light it, instead of using dry sticks for the fire, put some green or slightly damp wood in there. This will cause it to smoke, and if you have it hot enough in the first place, it will smoke for many hours as the fire is so contained and oxygen is restricted compared to a normal campfire. It's also highly portable, so you can pick the log up and move it closer to your tent or camp area if the wind changes direction. Being pine, it also burns with a thick pungent smoke, which I find works really well at repelling mosquitoes. If I find that the airflow in the log is just not enough, and it's constantly smouldering and not burning into a flame, then I would take an axe to it and split the rocket stove into 4 pieces. I then remove a bit more material from the inside of each piece to widen the hole in the middle and allow a lot more air to flow into it. Bugleweed is a common perennial plant that grows in shaded areas of deciduous woodlands. It's a member of the Lamiaceae family, and both the leaves and shoots are edible. However, it is more commonly used externally for the treatment of wounds. It contains substances that are also found in the digitalis plants, which have been used in treating heart conditions. More often than not, it is used as a homeopathic remedy to create medicated oils and ointments. It's good for throat irritations and mouth ulcers. The majority of tarps will generally have at least 4 tie-up points. The first tip is that I make sure to always have guy lines tied out on at least 4 corners of my tarp. These will stay on my tarp all year round. Most of my shelter setups can be made with just these 4 tie-out points, but sometimes I need to add 1 or 2 extra guy lines. The tarp I use is a square tarp, normally 3 by 3 meters, but with this ultralight one, it's actually 2.9 by 3 meters, so near enough a square shape. I normally have about 2.5 to 3 meters of cordage on my guy lines. On this particular tarp, I have used bank line, but I also use 550 paracord. If you want to set up your tarp in the quickest way possible, then it's better to bring some strong metal tent stakes with you. However, to save on weight and space in the pack, I tend to make my own, unless I am heading to an area of open land where there are very few trees. I look for thin sticks that have a number of broken branches and knots coming off them. This particular woodland is dense, with Scots pine being the predominant species. As it's dense, the trees are growing close together, and as a result, they grow really straight. This makes it ideal for quickly whittling up some stakes. Snap or saw the branches just above the knots. This small stick produced 7 stakes. These protruding branches act as a hook to stop your guy lines from falling off the stakes when you peg them out. Using a knife, I then put some points onto the ends of the stakes. For the first shelter, peg out the 4 corners of the tarp. Once all corners are pegged out, it pins the tarp to the ground and the wind shouldn't pull it up. From there, I then peg out the 2 tie-up points that are right next to the corner tie-ups. As each peg goes in, I pull the tarp diagonally so that there is tension between each peg. I do this to the 2 far corners of the tarp. This is going to be the back of the shelter, so ideally have the back facing the wind. That way the wind will blow up and over the shelter and not directly inside it where you are likely to be sleeping. I unpeg the 2 back corners of the tarp and tuck them underneath. The eagle-eyed among you might notice that I also have a guy line tied to the centre tie-up point of the tarp. This gets used in a different shelter which I will show you later on in the video. Now I come to the front of the tarp. I take the corner that was staked out and unpeg it. I find the next tie-up point along from it and add about 6 inches, then I flip the corner tie-up point to here and peg it in. I do the exact same thing to the other side. Find the next tie-up point from the corner, add a few inches, and then flip the corner in and peg it out. This will be the front of the shelter. Next up, I cut a branch about the thickness of my wrist. I use my bushcraft knife to bevel one end of the stick. This end is going to push up against the tarp, so it's best to make the end as smooth as possible. I leave the other end flat. Then I take my stick and place it underneath the centre of the tarp, making sure it is as straight as possible. This is where the beveled end of the stick needs to be facing the tarp material. You can add a shamag or a spare sock to the tip of the stick to stop it from piercing the tarp if you wish, but I've never had a problem by just beveling it. Now you don't have to do this next step, but I find it does help to make the tarp have more tension. Take a piece of cordage and tie to the next tie-up point from the front centre tie-up. Fold this piece of loose tarp back on itself and tie it off at the back corner peg. I use an adjustable guy line hitch to do this, which you can see in more detail in my tarp setup video in the description box below. Do exactly the same to the opposite side. Finally, you can add a guy line to the front centre of the tarp to tie out the entrance and help shed the rain away from the entrance of your shelter. Now you have a low profile tarp tent, which I find works well in strong winds as it has a number of angles to it. I find it tends to deflect the wind away from the shelter rather than act like a sail and catch the wind. The entrance at the front is tight, but it leaves a big enough gap for airflow, yet small enough that you're well sheltered from strong winds than you would be with an open tarp. There is a surprising amount of space inside the shelter. The great thing about this is that if you are camping in open ground and you prefer to carry a tarp in your kit as opposed to a tent, you can use an adjustable hiking pole to maintain the tension of the tent and set it to the height that you prefer. The lower the roof, the wider the space inside. The higher the roof, the narrower the space inside. The next shelter is for hammock campers. You only need to use the 4 tie-up points at the corners of the square tarp. First, find 2 trees that are just a bit wider than the width of your tarp. Tie one corner of the tarp to the tree. Now, there are a number of knots that you can use to tie a tarp to a tree. I tend to use a Siberian hitch. If you want to learn how to tie it, I recommend watching my tarp setup video in the description box below. Once you have tied the knot, grab the other corner of the tarp and tie this off to the opposite tree. Note that I am tying opposite ends of my tarp so that it is set up in a diagonal pattern. Once your tarp is secured in between the trees, you should have just 2 guy lines remaining. Grab these and peg the tarp out so that it is tight. Again, I use an adjustable guy line hitch so that I can adjust the tension of the tarp if the wind and rain make the tarp sag over time. Then head on over to the opposite side and do the same there. If the winds are strong, then don't use too much guy line. Just peg the tarp down as low as possible so that you are well sheltered from the wind. And that's it. With the 2 guy lines pegged out, you've set up a diamond fly tarp. All you need to do now is string your hammock in between the trees. The great thing about this setup is not only is it great in strong winds, but you can also adapt it to make it much more spacious when the weather has calmed down. All you need to do is undo one of the side guy lines, and this time take it further out to the side and tie it to a tree about head height. The other side should be the one that is protecting you from the wind. Meanwhile, you now have an open view of the forest, as well as the opportunity to have a fire underneath the tarp, providing that you have strung it high enough so that the sparks won't burn holes in it. If the storm has passed and there is little to no wind, then you can unpeg the other side and open it up to have a much wider area protected from above, and it allows you to have a 360-degree view of the surrounding woodland. Should the wind pick up again, you can just take the guy lines and tie them down as close as possible to the centre of the shelter to give you that added protection from the sides again. You'll notice that with this shelter setup, I don't have a specific ridgeline running through the loops in my tarp with prusik loops. This is because all I generally need is 4 guy lines on each corner of a tarp, and I have far more versatility for quicker tarp setups than I would with a pre-tied ridgeline. Heterohelix, or common ivy, contains a high level of active compounds which can be used to make a form of laundry detergent or soap. The active compounds we are looking to extract from the leaves is the saponins. To do this, gather a handful of small leaves and crush them up. Put this in a container and fill with water. Let the water boil for around 15 minutes. Take the container off the fire and leave to cool. Then filter the water into another container and you'll now have made some entirely natural soap. Please note that this species of ivy is easy to handle. It is not like poison ivy. Be sure to positively identify any ivy before you handle it. The lesser spotted dogfish is very common in British waters. It can be caught by boat or from the shore. It is edible, although not eaten as much nowadays. The skin of the dogfish is very unique. It has the rough texture of sandpaper and was once highly sought after to use when sanding down furniture. Word of warning, if you are squeamish, you might want to skip the next part. But this is a survival video, so if you want to learn, then carry on watching. First, you dispatch the fish. This one was dispatched earlier. Then use a knife and a pair of pliers to peel off the skin of the fish. You can then use the skin straight away as sandpaper, or you can dry it out, which makes the denticles in the skin stand out more, which will make it more abrasive. As part of my fishing kit, I carry a handful of wire traces, which I use when trying to catch predator fish that have sharp teeth, such as pike, perch and zander. Despite looking thin and flimsy, these wire traces are actually pretty strong. I wrap the wire trace around the 4 split logs and secure it in place. The reason I'm using wire and not paracord is because the paracord will burn and likely snap quite quickly, causing the logs to fall apart. Now I have a log with a much larger hole in it, and it still has the airflow hole on the side, so I can rotate it to face the direction of the wind to allow more oxygen and a better flame. If you don't have any wire trace on you, then what I tend to do is get my axe or hatchet and put a point on each of the pieces of the split log. Then I place all these pieces together and hammer them into the ground, whilst trying to make sure that the air intake hole is facing the wind. I then start a fire inside and add a handful of small twigs. The benefit of having the wider hole means there is more space for fuel, and therefore the fire will burn hotter and faster. I can also use some of the offcuts of pine that were removed when putting the points on the ends of them. Within minutes, the fire is ready for a pot or pan to go on. You can use stones or even 2 small sticks lying perpendicular to each other. Oxygen can still easily flow through the air intake and enter the main chamber, which is now much larger. The benefit of doing it this way means that you don't need any wire to hold the sticks together. You don't even really need the air intake hole, it just helps to get to a flame quicker. The downsides are that it will burn through the wood a lot faster than the rocket stove does. A simple, cheap monocular can help you identify good camping areas way ahead of you. You can clip them to your backpack so you can use it on the move, and it's so compact that it wouldn't take up much room in your pack. Using some vegetation as a backdrop, you can scout the area ahead to look for ideal locations to stealth camp, or check the movements of any people nearby. This particular one comes with a carry case, so you can attach it to your belt if you would prefer. When setting up a shelter, be it a tent, tarp, or even making a natural shelter, it needs to ideally be low profile and fast to set up. A small, lightweight tarp like this 2.9 by 3 meter tarp is ideal for most situations. A tarp is much more versatile than a tent and can often be quicker to set up. One of the best low profile tarp setups is to lay your tarp flat down on the ground, preferably with bushes and small vegetation nearby. Peg out the 4 corners of the tarp so that it is quite tight. Then cut a small stick and place this underneath the front of the centre of the tarp. Now you have a low profile shelter, but it's still quite visible. Add some camo netting over the top of the tarp to help blur the sharp edges and make it blend in more with the surrounding woodland. Take this one step further by adding nearby debris, be it leaves or branches from dead vegetation. The camo netting traps the leaves and stops them falling off, allowing you to cover your entire shelter. Though you are generally more exposed when hammock camping, as you will likely have a tarp above your head, you can still take steps to aid you when stealth camping. Using a hammock sleeve like this one means that you can quickly deploy or pack away your hammock at speed should you need to bail and get back to your vehicle. Just slide the sleeve back over the hammock, detach it from the tree, and it will save you a lot of time when packing up. This particular hammock has a fly net attached to it. This means that I can set my hammock up between 2 trees like normal, but this time use it as a ground shelter by laying the hammock on the floor and then raising the fly net and tying it to a tree a few feet above the ground. To make the shelter blend in more, I can throw over some camo netting and leaves like in the previous shelter, and all of a sudden I have a quick deploy ground shelter as well as a hammock. Granted, I would still need a tarp above my head if it were to rain, but something small and compact like the tarp used earlier would be easy enough to set up. If I wanted to be bold and build a shelter from natural materials, I often look for areas of woodland where there is already likely to be a fallen tree or plenty of materials to build with. This saves on half of the building time needed to make a shelter. For example, this tree root here offers full protection from one side. I only need to build 2 walls either side and make a raised bed so that if it rains I wouldn't be sitting in water, and then build a roof on top and provide some cover with any leaves or debris nearby. Be wary of any tree roots that look unstable, as some might collapse forward onto your shelter. As with any shelter, when stealth camping it's good to keep it minimum and low profile. Here's one I built by attaching some bin bags to a few sticks that I bent over to form a tunnel. I then broke up the outline of the shelter by using some leaves from a nearby bush. You'll notice that although the shelter blends in well, the ends of the cut wood are pretty white and still stand out. You can mask these by simply rubbing some mud over the cut ends, like in this example here. If you need to head further away from camp to collect water or gather more resources, and you are worried about someone finding your gear, you can place your pack in a bush and throw over some camo netting to keep it well hidden.
The limpet is a marine gastropod mollusk that is easily spotted clinging onto the rocks at low tide. Knock them off the rock with a stone. When you turn them upside down, you can see the yellow muscular foot. This is the edible part. You can either boil them or roast them upside down in their own shell. I boil them for around 10 to 15 minutes. They are tough, rubbery and not very palatable. When boiled, the muscular foot separates from the shell. There is a black sac at the top which contains its guts. You can eat this, but I prefer to remove this part and then eat them. The bow drill is an effective method of primitive firelighting, and one of the best resources to use for bow drill is common hazel. Hazel tends to grow multiple shoots from the same tree, and many of these saplings grow straight. This makes it ideal for the bow drill. Split a hazel stick in half and then flatten it out with your knife. This can be used as the half board. Cut a small 6 to 8 inch section of stick, round off one end and point the other end to make your spindle. Then use a slightly bent section to create your bow. You can even use a small piece of hazel as a bearing block to put pressure on the spindle. As long as the wood is dry, you can create an ember from a full hazel bow drill set. Another more primitive form of friction fire is the hand drill. Here I'm using a piece of elder which has a hollow pith, making it ideal for a hand drill spindle. For the hearthboard I'm using clematis, the climbing vine which I used to weave the basket made right at the beginning of this episode. It requires more effort to create fire this way, but it still uses the same principles through friction, heat and oxygen to help you get that ember. Yellow archangel is quite a menacing looking plant, with leaves similar to the stinging nettle and bright yellow flowers. It's in the Lamiaceae family, which is in the same family as mint. The leaves are in opposite pairs, and as with many plants in the Lamiaceae family, the stem is actually square. Both the leaves and the flowers are edible raw, but mature plants would taste better if steamed or steeped in a tea. It has many medicinal properties, which include blood cleansing and alleviating stomach and abdominal cramps.
The Scots pine tree, or Pinus sylvestris, is a fantastic bushcraft resource. It's easy to identify with its deeply fissured bark that turns slightly more orange and flaky as you look further up the tree. The branches contain thousands of pine needles which stay on the tree year round, and each nodule produces a pair of needles. These are a valued source of vitamin C and can be steeped in a tea for an immune boosting drink. At the base of this root system are hundreds of pine cones. Many people walk past them, but sometimes it's worth collecting a handful, as you can turn these into a valuable firelighting resource, which I will show you in a minute. A smart way to be prepared for a survival situation is to have some sort of small pouch to carry tinder. I made this small tinder pouch from a piece of leather. It's fitted with some leather cordage to tighten it up, and it can be fastened together with a piece of deer antler for a toggle. I will put a link to the video on how you can make this in the description box below. Whenever I'm out in the woods on a camping trip or even a day hike, if I spot any dry tinder, birch bark or other firelighting resource, I will collect it and store it in this tinder pouch. That way, if I find myself needing to light a fire and there are adverse weather conditions or all of the resources around me are damp, at least I have a dry source of tinder to get an initial fire started. It's always better to be prepared. When I get to camp, I can place the collected pine cones into a small tin. I put a hole in the top of this tin so that the air has space to escape, otherwise the pressure would build up inside. Seeing as I already have the rocket stove going, I place the tin on top of the fire and leave it there. Almost immediately there will be smoke coming out of the hole. This is a good thing, as it means the material inside is beginning to char, but not burn into a flame. The idea here is that I'm trying to burn the material to a point where it's charred, but does not combust and burn away to nothing. It's a process called pyrolysis, where oxygen is deprived from an organic material, and as a result its composition is changed as the gases are burnt off. It's the same process that is used to make charcoal. The smoke will burn thick for the first 10 minutes or so, and as soon as the smoke turns clear and starts to fade and stop, that's when it's time to put the gloves on and take the tin off the fire. Once it's cooled down enough, I take the lid off and you can see that all of the pine cones have charred and turned brittle. Now I have turned these pine cones into something that will catch a spark from a fire steel and smoulder into a hot coal. If I add this to a tinder bundle, such as dry bracken, I can blow air into it and it will reach a temperature hot enough to ignite the tinder bundle and go into flame. Digitalis purpurea, or as it's better known, the foxglove, a stunning biennial plant that grows in woodlands and on forest verges. With its bell-shaped flowers and bright, vivid colours, these striking plants are the standout queens of the woodland during June and into July. However, do not be deceived by the beauty and elegance of this plant. It's highly toxic and contains a digitoxin, which is a form of glycoside that can cause fatal heart failure and death if ingested. It doesn't just affect the heart, but can also cause severe vomiting, abdominal pain and blurred vision. Just 2 to 3 dried leaves can be enough for a fatal dose. It's not hard to identify when it's in this stage, as the flowers are so distinctive. However, as it's a biennial plant, the first year it only grows leaves low down to the ground. There are no flowers. These leaves can easily be misidentified with the edible primrose plant. The main difference is that the leaves of the foxglove are lance-like in shape and form a point at the end, whereas the primrose is more rounded. The stem of the foxglove is like velvet. It's incredibly smooth with soft, tiny hairs. Another highly toxic plant is ragwort. This yellow flowering plant is common amongst meadows and pasture land. It contains toxic alkaloids, which can damage the tubes in your liver over time, and can even contribute to liver cancer. Farmers will be well aware of this plant, as often when it dries, it gets cut up when the grass is cut for hay. Horses then ingest this, and it's very poisonous for them. It's fairly easy to identify with its scraggy leaves, which are lobed and toothed, and during June and July it has bright yellow flowers. On a more lighter note, let's take a look at an edible plant that you can often find at this time of year. This small purple flowering plant is growing on the verge of a large coniferous forest. It's called self-heal or Prunella vulgaris, and the key to this plant is in the name. It's part of the Lamiaceae family and has many medicinal properties, the main one of course being for healing. It can help to draw out infection and helps to stimulate the healing of wounds, burns and ulcers, and has been known to have styptic actions, helping to staunch the flow of blood. As well as that, it can help to fight inflammation and protect against cancer. It has small violet flowers that cluster at the top of the stem. The leaves are in opposite pairs, and as with most plants in the Lamiaceae family, the stem is square. The leaves can be crushed and put onto wounds to encourage healing.
The birch polypore is a common bracket fungus that grows on birch trees. It can be dried, crushed up and steeped in a tea. It has many medicinal properties including anti-inflammatory, antifungal, antiseptic and more. It's a powerful tonic for the immune system, but the soft porous underside of this fungus also has some good uses while it's still fresh from the tree. If you use your knife to score out a rectangular shape, you can then peel this back and use it as a makeshift plaster or band-aid. Wrap it around any wounds on your fingers and gently compress it, and it should hold its shape without you having to use any tape. You can also slice off a larger chunk of the fungi, and once dried, it can be used as a knife strop to hone your knife edge out in the field. The best way to identify a silver birch tree is by its bark, which clearly has a white silvery tone to it. The great thing about this bark is that it is packed full of resin, which makes it great for lighting fires. Even when dead, the tree tends to rot from the inside out, and so the bark is often the last part remaining. Use your knife to peel off a section of the bark, scrape some of the top layer into a fine dust pile. You'll notice it starts to go an orangey colour, this is the resin. Put some sparks to the dust pile with your fire steel and it will ignite. It burns even when the bark is really wet, making it an ideal natural fire lighter. But it's not just the outer bark that can be used for bushcraft and survival. During the spring, the sap will rise up the tree, carrying nutrients to the branches to grow new shoots and buds. You can literally tap into this part of the tree and gather the juicy sap to make an immune boosting drink. First, make a spile, a small piece of wood which will tap into the tree. I tend to use a green stick from the same branch growing from the tree to reduce the chance of the tree getting infected. Make a small upward cut into the tree with your knife. Place the stick inside this cut. It doesn't need to go deep into the tree, as the sap layer is only just under the bark. Then tie off a container below the tap and leave for a few hours to collect the drips of sap. The sap tastes really refreshing and is packed full of goodness. You can drink it straight from the tree or add it to a tea. There are a number of small bushes and shrubs that have large thorns on them. The hawthorn is one such tree. The thorns that grow from this tree can be used to make a primitive fishing hook. Look for thorns that are pointing slightly upwards. Snap off the stick either side of the thorn, but leave enough on the area above the thorn to whip on some fishing line. In this instance, I used a simple whipping from some cordage I made from the stem of a stinging nettle. If you whip two thorns back to back so they are facing opposite each other, these can be used to make a gorge hook, which essentially gets stuck in a fish's throat as they swallow the bait, and makes it much harder for them to fall off the hook. The crampball fungus grows on decomposing ash trees. Immature ones have a brown or maroon look to them, but once they turn black and go hard, they can be peeled off the tree and turned into a fire. Use a fire steel to shower sparks onto the soft underlayer of the fungus. If the fungus is dry, it will catch this spark and can then be blown into an ember. It glows like coal would in a fire, and it's sometimes referred to as the coal fungus. You can then use this glowing fungus in a tinder bundle such as this dead bracken here, and it can be blown into a flame. The fungus can also be used in conjunction with some wet moss to create a mosquito repellent torch, which you can place around your camp to deter mosquitoes. If you find your fish hook is starting to get blunt and you don't have a hook sharpener in your kit, you can use a smooth stone. Look for these smooth flat stones by rivers, lakes or the sea. Hold the tip of your fish hook parallel to the surface of the stone and then drag it back and forth across the surface. Apply gentle pressure, but keep the angle the same throughout the movement. After 8 to 10 strokes, lay the hook on its side and repeat the process. Then do the same to the other side. You're essentially sharpening 3 sides of the hook. You can do a quick test on the sharpness of the hook by putting the tip on your nail and turning your hand upside down. If it's sharp, it should hold in place on your nail and not fall off. Mentha aquatica, or water mint, can usually be found near water or damp woodlands. It can be steeped in a tea to help ease stomach problems, just like any other mint. It's also a great source of vitamin A, a fat-soluble vitamin that is critical for eye health and night vision. It's even been used to treat IBS. It's fairly easy to identify with its square stem and ribbed leaves, but the easiest way to identify it is to crush up the leaves in your hand. There should be a distinct minty smell to them. Waterreed has been used as a building material for hundreds, if not thousands of years. I've used it in a number of my builds. In this clip, I'm using it to make a roof on my Anglo-Saxon pit house. The reed is actually laid on the roof with the seed heads facing up. It seems contradictory, but the thicker and more sturdy part of the reed is more towards the stem, and this is where it hollows out more. This means that it can shed water much better, but can also take the weight of the bundle of thatch that is overlaid above it, without it bending and kinking. As the name suggests, it grows in water, but you do need a lot of it to create a waterproof roof. But if laid correctly, it can last 30 to 40 years before it needs replacing. Here's how you can make rope from a tree. Just find a small thin sapling about the thickness of your thumb or a little thicker. Grab the tip of the sapling and begin to twist it in your hands. As you twist it in your hands, start to rotate your arms too, as if you are demonstrating pedaling a bike. As you twist it, you will begin to hear the inner fibres of the sapling start to pop and give way, which will allow you to continue to twist it even more. Work your way down towards the base, and then when you can't twist anymore, cut it off. Now you have some rudimentary tree rope. Conditions were a little dry on this go, and so the fibres split a little too much. But if you look at this section here, you can see that the entire sapling is still intact, yet it is bendy and malleable like rope. Rotten tree stumps of conifer trees often have fragments of wood that is starting to decompose but is not quite rotten yet. It's also usually packed full of resin, as when the tree dies, the resin is sent down to the root system to try and make it live. It's basic tree survival. This partially rotten wood is referred to as punk wood. Put fragments of the wood in a small metal tin and make a hole in the top. Place the tin on a campfire and let the wood inside start to char. Smoke will start billowing out of the hole, and after a few minutes the smoke will start to burn clearer. This is a sign that the charring process is complete. You will now have charred wood. Throw some sparks on it from a fire steel or use a flint and steel to help it ignite. Honeysuckle is a climbing plant found in woodlands and hedgerows. It comes to leaf fairly early in the year, and the flowers and leaves contain salicylic acid, which can be used to treat headaches. The berries are toxic, so best to avoid those. The bark itself is flaky and can be peeled off and buffed together in your hands to create a tinder bundle. It does burn fast, so be sure to have more tinder material ready to pass on that early flame. Jack by the hedge, or garlic mustard, is a common wild edible that grows in woodland verges and hedgerows. It has distinctive heart-shaped leaves. When crushed, the leaves give off a mild garlic scent. When eaten raw, they are slightly bitter, with a little kick of mustard. They are great when stuffed in fish or meat and cooked over the fire. Historically, the plant has been used to treat asthma, bronchitis, and eczema. The A-frame shelter is one of the easiest and most efficient survival shelters to make. All you need is a long piece of wood to make a ridgepole, and then lean some vertical sticks against this ridgepole on either side. Cover the sticks with moss or debris, and you have yourself a survival shelter. You can also make an A-frame shelter from a tarpaulin. It sheds water really well, and is good in strong winds. When by the sea, one of the first options for food is seaweed. There are a huge number of edible seaweeds out there. Here is some bladderwrack. It can be eaten raw or boiled. The young tips are tender. It's high in iodine, fibre, vitamins and minerals. Here is some sea lettuce, found in rock pools. This one's high in protein and can be eaten raw or dried out and eaten like crisps. Here is some gutweed. It's very common in rocks that are high on the shoreline. You can eat it raw, but it's best fried over a fire to get the best flavour from it. Greater stitchwort is a common flowering plant that is edible, found in both woodlands and fields. The leaves are long, thin and lance-shaped, and each set of leaves is opposite to the pair below it. The leaves and flowers are edible and go well in a wild food salad. Historically, it had been used to treat muscle aches and cramps, hence the name stitchwort. If you want to carry a portable fishing kit with you in your pack, you can make your own from a small stick. Carve away the bark from the lower section of the stick. This is where you can store your fishing line. Tie an arbor knot to secure your fishing line to the stick, then wrap it around the stick evenly. The deeper you cut this section, the more fishing line you can store on there. Use a piece of tape to secure the end of the fishing line and stop it unravelling. At the opposite end of the stick, create a hole using your knife. This can be used to store your fishing hooks and weights. Then carve another small piece of wood to act as a stopper cap. If you want some added grip for the handle, you can wrap some bank line around it. This can also be used for other things, such as stringing up a tarp or making a bow drill. Now the hand line is complete. All that is needed is to tie a hook on the end, add a weight to it, cast your bait out and wait for that bite. If you wake up in the morning and find that your fire has completely gone out and there are no hot coals, you can still get a fire going from it. Pick up the powdered white ash and fine grains of charcoal. Place this into some cotton wool or dry fluffy tinder and roll it into a tube like a cigarette. Use a flat surface and a flat piece of wood, roll the cotton wool tube back and forward, applying pressure as you do it. This will create friction, which then creates heat. This heats up the ash and charcoal particles to a point where they start to combust. Add some more air to it and you can bring it to an ember. To make a wood drinking cup from a small log, cut off a piece about 3 inches in diameter and a height of roughly 6 inches. Batten the piece of wood into 4 separate pieces. Number each individual piece of log with a piece of charcoal or a stick covered in mud. This will help when you need to put them back together again. Then, saw a groove about 1 inch above the bottom of the cup, and use your knife to remove some material from the inner parts of these quarters. When you put the pieces back together again, you will have a cavity. Now, just fasten the cup together again with some cordage. I use bank line as it doesn't tend to slip. Now your cup can hold water. However, it will leak some small drips, as inevitably water will always find a route out. To help seal it totally, you can use the tree resin as I showed earlier in the video, or you can soak it in water so that the wood expands and it seals the holes. The gorse bush is a common evergreen shrub found in coastal heathlands and on forest edges. It has nitrogen fixing roots, which means it can grow in poor soils. It has large, spiky thorns and yellow flowers, which can appear year-round. The flowers are edible, as are the buds. However, the seeds and seed pods are toxic. I find the flowers taste similar to almond and coconut. Moss is not only good for a bedding material and insulating bushcraft shelters, but it's also great for holding and storing water. If you don't have anything to carry water with you in a survival situation, you can soak the moss in a lake or river and allow it to absorb the water. It can carry a surprising amount. And on those really hot summer days, you can keep this damp moss with you and use it to cool down during the hotter hours of the day. A whistle is an ideal item to carry in your survival kit. They don't take up much space in your pack, and they are a great way of attracting attention. If you don't have a whistle on you, you can use a blade of grass to create a similar sound. Place the blade of grass between your thumbs so that the edge of the grass is facing you. Pinch your thumbs together and blow through the gap between them. Now you have a makeshift whistle, which can create just as much noise as a conventional whistle. And there's plenty more blades of grass about if one of them fails you. Alternatively, you could use the cap of an acorn to create a similar effect. This time, put the acorn cap between the knuckles of your thumbs and create a V shape so that the top edge of the acorn cap is visible. Then, blow air between the gap of your thumbs and across the edge of the acorn cap. It should produce a loud whistle. You can reuse the acorn cap hundreds of times, so it might be worth keeping one in your pack in case you need to use it. When it's raining and everything on the forest floor is wet, it can be tricky to get a fire going. If you split your wood down into fine kindling, it exposes the dry inner wood, which is much more likely to get a flame. Use your knife to slice fine curls of this dry inner wood to make feather sticks. Then hold your fire still against the feather stick and shower it with sparks. These fine curls should take a spark quickly and ignite into flame. Then just add more feather sticks on top and the rest of your dry kindling, and soon enough you should have a fire. Greater reed mace is a common water-based plant that grows around lakes and pond shorelines. The roots of the plant, called rhizomes, are packed full of carbohydrates in the form of starch and are generally available all year round. It's one of the best survival plants in terms of food. Clean up the rhizome and place it on a campfire and cook until blackened, around 20 minutes. Then peel back the outer layer, which reveals the inner fibres at the centre, which are edible. Beware of poisonous lookalikes though. The seed head of the plant is easy to identify as it looks like a sausage on a stick. Peel back the outer layer to reveal hundreds of fluffy seeds. These can be ignited with a fire still and used as a tinder. It is a flash tinder though, so it burns quite fast. Another key survival plant is the dandelion. Widely available across Eurasia and North America, all parts of the plant are edible. It has distinctive sawtooth leaves and a prominent central white vein. The roots run deep and can be dried and ground down to make a coffee. The compound yellow flowers can be fried in a batter or eaten in salad. The stinging nettle, Urtica dioica, has been used as a herbal medicine for hundreds of years. They have one of the highest yields of vitamin C in any plant. The youngest leaves are generally the best tasting. To eliminate the sting, either hold them over a fire to blanch them, or put the leaves in a pot of boiling water and allow to steep for 10 minutes. They also make a really tasty soup. The stem of the stinging nettle can make fantastic cordage. Use your knife or thumb to prise open the pith of the nettle, then peel back the outer strands. These are what will be used for the cordage. Begin to twist one of the strands between your fingers. Once twisted enough, you can bring your fingers together and it will naturally want to rotate on itself. This is the start of your cord. Now continue to roll it between your fingers, pulling it tight and back on itself after each roll. Eventually you will have formed natural string, which when dried will become really tough. In the autumn, the sweet chestnut tree produces spiky cupules. Inside these spiky outer casings is a nut, the sweet chestnut. Gather some of these nuts and lightly roast them over a fire for 20 minutes. Peel back the outer hard shell to reveal the sweet, tasty inner nut. Historically, the nuts were ground down to make flour and added to bread recipes. The most efficient way to boil and cook food when camping is likely to be a gas stove. However, as efficient as these are at boiling water, they tend to be pretty loud. The most discreet way of boiling water would be a meths burning stove or alcohol burner. I keep a full cook kit in this camo case. It houses my stove, cook cup and drinking cup all in one compact carry bag which has molly webbing on the back to attach it to the outside of my bag should I need to. I pour the methylated spirit into the Trangia burner and light it. You can see that it burns with an almost invisible flame. I fold over the pot stand and place my pot of water on top and add the lid. Now I leave that to boil whilst I finish setting up camp. The great thing about this type of fuel burner is that it makes no noise whilst boiling the water, and it doesn't give off any smell like a campfire would. It takes a few more minutes to boil water than a gas stove would, but it's a hell of a lot quieter and ideal for stealth camping. Another, more compact stealth cooker is a folding hexi stove. These often come in military MRE ration packs. Essentially, it's a flat piece of metal that you fold into a small stove. Then you light the hexamine heating tablets that come with the stove and place your pot on top. This is another really compact way of cooking food and boiling water, as well as giving off very little smoke and noise. If you find that you need to make a fire for warmth, then the best option would be to dig a Dakota fire pit. This is essentially one hole about 12 inches deep and then another smaller hole next to it about the same depth. Then use a stick to create a hole or tunnel between these two holes. Now make your fire in the larger hole and the smaller hole acts as a wind tunnel to keep air and oxygen supplying your fire. Now you have a discreet fire that hides the flames well and allows you to cook food or boil water. However, this doesn't stop the fact that your fire might produce lots of smoke, which could be a huge giveaway when stealth camping. To prevent this, it's important that you only burn dead, dry wood. The drier the better. Here are two fire lays. The one on the left has dry wood, and the one on the right has damp, wet wood. Both burn fairly well to begin with because I lit them both with a strong firelighter. However, after a few minutes the fire on the right is struggling to produce enough heat to burn efficiently. If I go to add small twigs that are still green and damp, you will see that it instantly starts to smoke.
Now, even if the fire on the left is burning well, if I add wet wood to that, it will start to smoke too. And now you can see that after just a few seconds of adding wet wood, there is smoke billowing from the fire. This is now a massive giveaway of my location, and I would be visible even from many kilometres away. So ideally, try and find dead dry wood that is hanging up in tree branches and off the ground. If comfort is your thing and you don't wish to be cramped inside a small bivvy bag or tarp, then a standard 2-person tent works just as well, providing you don't set it up in open ground that is easily visible. I normally opt for a tent that has a dark inner tent and dark olive green or brown outer fly sheet. The reason being is that some lightweight tents have a brighter inner tent and lightweight fly sheet. These are generally made with thin material in order to be lightweight. However, the cost of having this lighter material means that at night, when you are inside your tent with a head torch or light on, your tent will light up much more and therefore be more visible in the dark. The tents that have thick inner linings and outer fly sheets cut down the light given off by your head torch when inside and reduce the chance of your tent being spotted in the distance. If you need to make a quick getaway and break down camp fast, the large dry sack is an ideal piece of kit to have inside your pack. When rolled up, it takes up very little space, but when you need to get a wet tent or tarp packed away quickly, you can just shove it inside your dry bag and head off. This saves a lot on time and hassle of trying to roll it up inside its own carry sack.
The great thing about small hatchets over large axes is that they are portable. You can often carry some of the smaller ones on your belt. The issue I've found with having them tucked into your belt is that they can really restrict movement. You can eliminate this by using a simple piece of paracord. Take a piece of the cord, bring the ends together and tie them in a knot. This creates a loop. Now pass this loop through your belt and then pass the knot through the loop like you would with a prusik knot for tying onto the ridgeline of a tarp. Pull the knot tight and you have yourself a small loop dangling from your belt. Now you can pass the handle of your hatchet through this loop and it will sit close to your hip, but not too tight that it restricts your movement. Whenever you go to kneel down, the axe moves freely. It's also dead easy to deploy whenever you need to use it. Once you're done, just loosen the loop and pull it free from your belt. You can keep this piece of cordage in your kit, ready to deploy whenever you need to use it. It doesn't have to be used for just hatchets too. I've also used it for carrying a water bottle on me. Thanks for watching this video, subscribe if you enjoyed it, and if you want to see even more like this, then head to my Wilderness and Survival Skills video playlist on the homepage of my channel. I will put a link to it in the description box below. Cheers for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.